Meanwhile, an influential Muslim group, the Council on American Islamic Relations Chicago chapter, with this statement, quote, "We stand squarely against vigilante violence, even against those who may be complicit in genocide. It is lawless and criminal. We also reject the cynical attempts to link an act of a lone wolf to the movement of tens of thousands of peaceful anti-genocide protesters on our streets and in our schools. The fact is, the shooter departed from our peaceful movements, instead choosing to adopt Israeli government tactics. Israel assassinated 7 foreign embassy personnel in Damascus a year ago. Lastly, we urge the media and the public to show equal concern for all victims of violence. For months, hundreds of innocent Gazan children have been slaughtered and thousands now face deadly starvation. I have yet to receive a request for a statement. I reject the insinuation that their lives are any less worthy. Their stories deserve the same attention, outrage, and empathy." There is a lot to unpack in that statement, and joining us now is the head of CARE Chicago, Ahmed, Rehab. Ahmed, good to see you again. I have to take issue with one of the things you said. You say you condemn this, quote, "even for supporters of genocide." These are 2 innocent murder victims. Why include that statement?
Well, because I know what you don't know, which is there's a lot of chatter on social media, those individuals pointing out that 1 or 2 of these individuals were associated with the genocide, with the Israeli government that is undertaking the current genocide that you and I see on our TVs every day. So my statement is actually going out of its way to say, even if that is the case, these individuals should not be targeted for harm. So it's a very strong statement. It's made stronger by this addition, not weaker by this addition.
Let me
Framing the critic as ignorant, even though the critic's concern is moral clarity, not social media chatter. CARE doesn't disavow those making the accusation. Instead, it amplifies the conspiracy theory that 2 diplomats deserve suspicion or worse. CARE regularly condemns anti-Muslim bigotry rooted in online chatter, yet now uses it to justify hedging on a murder condemnation. CARE is not neutral here. It's affirming that Israel is committing genocide. By saying these victims were associated with that government, CARE reinforces the logic of the murderers. This undermines the idea that CARE strongly condemns the violence. It legitimizes the rationale behind it, pretends that stating even if they were complicit is a way of defending them, not subtly justifying the attack. A truly moral statement would say there is no excuse for these murders, the victims were innocent, and anyone suggesting otherwise is wrong. Claims that the morally hedged condemnation is stronger because it acknowledges a hypothetical justification, even as it claims to reject that justification, appears to cover all sides while leaving a poisonous ambiguity intact. This isn't a clarification, it's a doubling down. Would they ever say of murdered Muslims, "We oppose their killing," even if they were part of a terrorist group?
Let me read some of the background of Sarah Milgram, one of the victims. She was one of the embassy staffers. She was, quote, "a devoted and active volunteer for Tech to Peace, an organization that provides entrepreneurial training to young Palestinians and Israelis alongside conflict dialogue." Does she deserve to be referred to as a supporter of genocide, or potentially a supporter of genocide?
But this statement does not refer to her as a supporter of genocide.
So you're saying the gentleman, Yaron...
Well, regardless, I'm saying even if someone is proven to be a supporter of genocide, even then you cannot harm these individuals. You should not target these individuals with assassination. So I'm going further in my statement to say, regardless of whether someone is against the genocide or for it, human life here should be sacred in America. Deborah Silverstein, for example, she's somebody who has voted in City Hall against the ceasefire to allow the continuous mass murder of children. I don't think that she should be someone who should be put in harm's way, even though I disagree with her politically, even though I think that she's allowed this to happen.
When you mentioned
This repeats the smear that these victims may have supported genocide, now elevated from social media chatter to a hypothetical proven fact. Rather than asserting the victim's innocence, CARE preemptively imagines guilt and then claims moral high ground by opposing their murder anyway. This is a false equivalence. Being a diplomat does not equal being a supporter of genocide. The bar is moved in a way that reinforces the killer's narrative. The necessity of even saying this only makes sense if you think there's a debate to be had. This is a framing trick. He recasts the entire quote as a bold moral advance, not a moral compromise. In reality, what he's actually done is insert conditional language into what should be an unconditional condemnation. This false symmetry against genocide or for it implies Americans are split on whether genocide is good or bad, a rhetorical distortion. Who exactly is, quote, for, unquote, genocide in this context? He's clearly implying Israeli officials and possibly Jews support Israel while hiding behind universalist language. This can be read as, yes, they were guilty, but don't act without our permission. Contrast this with other CARE statements, such as those after a hate crime, that don't go out of their way to say, even if this person had unsavory beliefs, they declare it wrong, full stop. CARE's spokesperson has built a scaffold of plausible deniability. We oppose the murder, but we understand why some believe it was justified. But we still oppose it, because murder is bad, even if they were complicit in genocide, which they may have been. This is not moral leadership. This is a soft endorsement dressed up as restraint. It tells you more about CARE's audience than it does about its principles.
Was one of the embassy staffers. She was, quote, a devoted and active volunteer for Tech to Peace, an organization that provides entrepreneurial training to young Palestinians and Israelis alongside conflict dialogue. Does she deserve to be referred to as a supporter of genocide, or potentially a supporter of genocide?
But this statement does not refer to her as a supporter of genocide.
So you're saying the gentleman, Yaron...
Well, regardless, I'm saying even if someone is proven to be a supporter of genocide, even then, you cannot harm these individuals. You should not target these individuals with assassination. So I'm going further in my statement to say, regardless of whether someone is against the genocide or for it, human life here should be sacred in America. Deborah Silverstein, for example, she's somebody who has voted in City Hall against the ceasefire to allow the continuous mass murder of children. I don't think that she should be someone who should be put in harm's way, even though I disagree with her politically, even though I think that she's allowed this to happen.
This is a blood libel, suggesting that a city council member is personally responsible for child murder by casting a procedural vote. CARE's representative shifts from talking about Israel to accusing an American Jewish official of enabling murder. Whether or not he says don't hurt her, he's just told you why someone might want to. Like the embassy workers, Silverstein is placed in a category of people whose guilt is assumed, but whose targeting is discouraged. It's not a defense, it's a warning with a fig leaf. She's complicit in the murder of children, but don't hurt her. The speaker is explicitly saying Deborah Silverstein has enabled the mass murder of children. That's not a policy disagreement, that's a de facto accusation of war crimes. And again, no call for civic engagement, protest, or democratic redress. Just a reluctant admission that she shouldn't be harmed despite what she's done. This isn't civil rights discourse. It's a morally inverted defense of those who believe violence is justified.
When you mentioned they adopted Israeli tactics,
yes.
Israeli government tactics, it seems like this statement of support was actually maybe a veiled insult on supporters of the Israeli cause. Let's say that.
So that reference that you just made now is in reference to the shooter, not to the victims. That he adopted the Israeli tactics of targeting personnel at embassies, which is a factual statement.
But to include that he's adopting Israeli government tactics in a statement.
I mean, as a journalist, facts should be a good thing for you.
But where you're condemning an act of violence against two victims that happen to be supporters of Israel or Jewish.
But you can walk and chew gum. So I condemn these acts completely and fully and without equivocation. No buts or ifs, full stop, end of the line. New paragraph, new line. The fact of the matter is hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of innocent human beings are being killed every single day in Gaza by this government, the Israeli government, and the IDF soldiers who are involved in the military campaigns in Gaza. We're not hearing condemnations here from the same politicians. We're not getting invitations to studios to talk about these dead children. Their lives matter too. And so both of these things are true. One does not take away from the other. I condemn this murder. This is an invitation to chaos. We cannot allow this to stand. There cannot be vigilante violence against individuals.
The speaker insists there are no ifs or buts, and then proceeds to deliver nothing but ifs and buts. We oppose murder, but let us remind you why the victim might have supported coming. This comes after paragraphs of highly equivocal, hedged, and conditional language. If he truly meant no buts or ifs, he would not have earlier added caveats like, even if they were complicit in genocide, or there's a lot of chatter that they were involved, or Deborah Silverstein voted to allow the mass murder of children. Intended to justify holding two truths at once, but it's used here to excuse the insertion of extremely loaded accusations into a statement that allegedly just about condemning murder, implying that Jewish deaths get attention while Palestinian deaths don't. This is false on its face. Mainstream Western media has given wall-to-wall coverage to casualties in Gaza, but it also suggests the murder of Jewish civilians might be understandable because someone else is getting more attention. CARE sees itself as excluded when, in fact, its spokespeople are regularly featured on national TV, as this interview itself shows. He's pretending that talking about the murder of civilians on American soil is somehow equal to airing public disagreements about Gaza. But CARE didn't simply hold two views in parallel, it inserted the Gaza narrative into the murder condemnation in a way that taints the victims and rationalizes the motives. This is coming after 3 layers of contextual justification. This feels like a PR backstop, not a sincere conclusion.
Against individuals,
and
regardless of their position.
Your own cause, too.
Of course.
When it is a peaceful, you want it to be a peaceful cause.
Our cause is peaceful, and this person is not associated with our cause. As a matter of fact, I completely condemn any remarks that suggest cynically that he is somehow associated with our cause, like Deborah Silverstein's comments, that are attempting to link a very peaceful movement. You're not going to get assassinated walking into a campus where you're seeing dancing and prayer amongst these students who are just against the murder of innocent children. That's their cause. This individual is not part of that peaceful movement, and his actions are an invitation to chaos, and they're criminal, and I have no empathy for him.
This line is a shield, meant to deflect any connection between CARE or the broader anti-Israel movement it supports and the assassination. But the speaker has spent the entire prior monologue rationalizing violence in Gaza, defaming diplomats as, quote, complicit in genocide, unquote, and accusing a Jewish city official of enabling the murder of children. This is the classic, quote, he's not with us, unquote, line. But no evidence has been provided that the killer was being linked to CARE, other than by critics pointing out that CARE's rhetoric fuels a wider climate of hatred. This isn't a rebuttal to an actual accusation. It is a preemptive strike against criticism by mischaracterizing it. No one needs to say the killer belonged to CARE for CARE's rhetoric to be seen as contributing to the moral framework that makes violence thinkable. After naming Silverstein earlier as someone who, quote, enabled the mass murder of children, unquote, the speaker now accuses her of making a cynical link between a, quote, peaceful movement and violence. But CARE's own words have already established that they believe Israeli diplomats and Jewish officials are complicit in genocide, understand why people feel like targeting them, just the opposite, doing so outside legal channels. This is an overly romantic portrayal of a movement that in many cases has featured chants like glory to the martyrs, Intifada revolution, and open praise for Hamas. There have been threats, anti-Semitic harassment, and outright support for October 7th atrocities on campuses. The statement idealizes the protesters while demanding others ignore the parts that have crossed into hate speech and terror glorification. The speaker insists there is no overlap between violent actors and the broader pro-Palestinian movement. But the ideological overlap is clear. Both view Israeli Jewish institutions as complicit in genocide. Whether or not the killer went to a protest, he's acting on the same moral logic CARE is promoting. They're killing children. But this moral clarity arrives after paragraphs of deflecting, contextualizing, and lashing out at critics like Silverstein.
And your point about the media perhaps not covering the death, the slaughter of Gazans, innocent Gazans, with the same level of perhaps attention that they are covering some of this. I can only speak on Chicago and what's happened here, and I can say that we've covered the death of Wadi, the murder of Wadi al-Fayumi.
And I've been in the studio with you before talking about these things. So
we do want...
Present company accepted. But
hate is hate. Hate is hate, and we want to cover it if it's against the Muslim community, the Jewish community.
Yeah, but Paris, here's the narrative that we're missing. This is a fact, that there hasn't been the same outrage that I share now with others who are outraged against this crime when it comes to the innocent civilians in Gaza that are being murdered every day. And this includes people like Deborah Silverstein, who has no moral ground to stand on to talk about how our movement is or isn't, because she has stood with a government that's been killing innocent people every single day and starving them to death, banning cordons of trucks of food and aid to children who are dying because they can't find milk and basic foods and medicines.
The word "but" signals that what follows will override everything that came before, including his alleged condemnation of violence. This is a deflection setup. He's preparing to recenter the conversation on Palestinian victimhood, not the actual murder victims under discussion. There has been massive media, political, and global outrage about Gaza, daily headlines, UN condemnations, campus protests, celebrity statements, and congressional resolutions. The idea that Gaza deaths are being ignored is false and used here to justify downplaying a terrorist double homicide in the U.S. This is a direct ad hominem attack on a Jewish city council member. She's accused not just of political disagreements, but of moral disqualification, a common tactic to discredit Jewish voices who support Israel. Earlier, he said he had no empathy for the killer. Now he's using the murder to attack the murdered victims' political allies, suggesting their moral outrage is illegitimate because they support Israel. He again describes the Israeli government in genocidal terms as actively engaged in mass killing and starvation. The implication is Deborah Silverstein is complicit in genocide. Again. This is part of a pattern where, after the third or fourth time in the full remarks where he links an American Jewish official to war crimes, yet he claims to oppose incitement and violence. This is the kind of rhetorical groundwork that terrorists use to justify targeting civilians. No one denies that the humanitarian in Gaza is grave, but this isn't an honest attempt at balance. It's a weaponized narrative being used to shift attention away from murdered victims and legitimize a moral framework where someone like Silverstein deserves no sympathy. He accuses others of lacking moral clarity while refusing to call two Israeli diplomatic employees innocent without attaching a long list of grievances.
But what she's saying is her community, the Jewish community, feels unsafe now because they feel targeted. At least can you sympathize with folks feeling unsafe, whether they support the Israeli government or not? These are Chicago or American residents.
There's no doubt about that, and our statements have always been in that direction.
And not to minimize the Muslim communities felt unsafe,
look,
of course.
Care Chicago's position and mine has been consistently for 2 decades against violence. We basically follow in Martin Luther King's ideology of, standing up against hate and always being aligned with nonviolent, peaceful resistance to hatred and to what is happening in the world that is evil and ugly. So that's never changed. Our position has always been clear, and we condemn this act not to please or placate, but because these are our principles. However, her and others have not spoken out in the same outrage that we have today, and it's genuine outrage. This is an act of chaos and an act of unbecomely violence against the same kind of violence that's being perpetrated by the state actors in Israel that they support. They will come in the studio and tell you that they're supporters of Israel. I'm not a supporter of Hamas. I've never said I'm a supporter of Hamas. And yet questions are put to me about Hamas's actions. They are proud supporters of Israel, but somehow we're not supposed to ask them about Israel and the accountability Israel is supposed to have for the murder of children and innocent people.
Reputation laundering, a classic appeal to history. We've always opposed violence. But past consistency is not a shield against current double standards, especially since the speaker just spent minutes accusing Jewish public figures of being complicit in genocide, the exact sort of rhetoric that historically precedes violence. Borrowed moral authority, invoking MLK is a common rhetorical move to appear morally upright and rooted in civil rights traditions. But the tone and substance of the speaker's remarks are far removed from King's ethic of radical empathy, universal dignity, and restraint in language. King didn't say, "I oppose your murder, but you may have deserved it." He insists the condemnation is principled, yet spent every prior paragraph justifying, contextualizing, and minimizing the very act he claims to oppose. This is a pivot from "we condemn" to "what about them?" It reveals the underlying resentment. The condemnation is genuine, but resentfully so. There's a false equivalency here. He's equating a double homicide on U.S. soil with policy support for Israel, as if they're morally symmetrical. The speaker says, yes, this was chaos, like what Israel does. The translation is, this murder was bad, but no worse than what those people you support do every day. If you say the murder of diplomats is unbecoming violence, but then say Israel commits the same kind, you're implying the murders were at least understandable. That's not condemnation. That's a rhetorical pat on the back to the killer. He claims it's unfair that he gets asked about Hamas even though he doesn't support them. But the reason he gets asked is because he won't denounce Hamas clearly, directly, or by name. Meanwhile, he's angry that supporters of Israel aren't interrogated for the actions of a democratic state fighting a war. While he claims total separation from Hamas in a movement whose protests often openly glorify it. When Muslims are accused of terrorism, CARE consistently demands that rhetoric and associations be treated sensitively. The final note is once again not grief, not clarity, but accusation. It ends not with solidarity or healing, but with a plea to shift moral focus away from the murdered Jews in America and back onto alleged Israeli war crimes. CARE's spokesperson wants it both ways. To publicly condemn murder while privately empathizing with the killer's worldview, to appear nonviolent while describing Jewish officials as enablers of genocide, and to claim victimhood while refusing accountability for his own organization's rhetorical radicalism. This implies the embassy workers might deserve violence, just not outside legal channels. CARE often denounces Islamophobia when Muslims are presumed guilty by association, such as for working at a mosque where a terrorist once visited. But here, it tacitly accepts the idea that working for Israel could make someone complicit in genocide. This dehumanizes the victims and frames the violence as understandable, even if not technically justifiable. We stand squarely against vigilante violence sounds firm until it's immediately undermined by the qualifier. When CARE condemns attacks on Muslims or Palestinians, the language is often absolute, not hedged. For example, after U.S. drone strikes, CARE doesn't say, "We condemn the drone strike even if the target was a suspected terrorist." They omit the justification entirely. Here, they insert one. There's no acknowledgement that two people were murdered in cold blood. CARE statements about Muslims injured in hate crimes usually begin with emotional appeals. We are heartbroken, or our prayers are with the victim's family. In this case, no grief, no names, no humanity, just an abstract stance on vigilante violence. CARE decries the weaponization of language when Muslims are painted with a broad brush, yet here they accuse Israeli diplomats of genocide by employment without evidence or legal process. Calling it vigilante violence minimizes what was almost certainly a terrorist assassination. If a white supremacist murdered two Muslim embassy workers, CARE wouldn't call it vigilante violence, they'd rightly call it terrorism, hate crime, and murder. When Jews are murdered, the language becomes clinical and abstract. There is no call for the killer to be brought to justice or for law enforcement to act. In other cases, such as after mosque vandalism or a job-pulling incident, CARE urges police and the DOJ to take immediate action. By bringing up genocide, the statement suggests that even if someone is a victim, they might really be the aggressor. This creates a false equivalence that being Israeli or working for an embassy makes you inherently suspect and possibly deserving of violence. This statement is meant to appear moderate to media and allies, but it may also signal approval, or at least understanding, to a more radical audience. Avoiding accountability for openly endorsing terrorism while quietly legitimizing it. It's not a condemnation, it's a justification in disguise.